Welcome to This Week in Coworking, where industry leaders get succinct, actionable insights. Here are your hosts, Hector and Mike LaRosa.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Week 7's Coworking recap from the team here at This Week in Coworking. We're joined this week by a guest co-host. The co-host who probably doesn't need any introduction, but I will do it anyway. Ben Wright from the Instant Group. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm great, Hector. Good to be here. We shared the stage at GWA in Phoenix, so this is not our first rodeo, as you might say in the States. And I'm saying that for my colleagues around the world who may not have ever seen a rodeo, but this is not our, so great to be here.
Do you know that I have not seen a rodeo yet? I have to fix that. I've been here for too long to not be able to still be able to say that. So we're going to fix that and we'll make sure it happens. And I'll make sure you're there, Ben. But before we dive into the newsletter this week, the Instant Group is this week's sponsor. There's a lot of really interesting things happening at the Instant Group. But first, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ben. What should we know about everything that's changing at the Instant Group right now?
Yeah, the word Worka is something that Instant has talked about for 2 years, about as long as I've been at the company. And we launched late last year our Worka partner portal, which is a dramatically better way for companies to manage their listings with us. But that's really just the start. Instant has been at this for 27 years, global company, lots and lots of corporate relationships. And the world that we're expanding into is really about participating in co-creating or creating a smarter working world. So that means making investments in our tech, which that was the first of 3 announcements that we'll be making, along with a new marketplace and a product for corporates. It's investing in dramatically more marketing in markets all over the world, which of course is great for our operator partners and generates more leads. It's investing in more sales teams globally in 50 markets around the world. And coming with that, it's us really trying to take a step forward in the way that we partner with operators financially, right? So all of these investments cost money, which means there are certain types of leads that we're going to charge differently for. There are certain types of leads we won't. And there are certain ways that we're going to respond to our big clients. We manage, roughly 40 global portfolios, and many of them have said, hey, can we have one bill as opposed to 20? And so we're doing all these things as a way to really exist and help the industry, as well as our business, move forward in a smarter working world. So excited to field any questions around that and talk through the current news of the day too.
Absolutely. And I've got a whole bunch of questions. I've been following the acquisition spree, the moves, the mergers, the planning, all these things coming together, the new brand, if it's going to be a new brand. I have a lot of questions. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the operators who use your platforms or your services and work with you have a whole bunch of questions as well. So I'm going to let a little bit of the cat out of the bag here. You've actually agreed to join us again on the podcast exclusively to sit down for however long it takes, not however long it takes. We'll sit down for a good session of time just to answer some of those questions that maybe we or operators may have. And we're actually putting that out there as an invite. If you are reading this news, you're hearing what Ben's saying, you're hearing what's happening, you're hearing about some changes and you do have questions, reach out, go to the newsletter, hit that button that lets you submit questions. We're going to field all your questions from all around the world. And we're going to sit down with Ben and we're going to quiz him, and we're going to quiz him hard about all the things you want to know about these changes. Ben, are you looking forward to that?
It's so funny, Hector, because you called this the hot seat when we were together in Phoenix. And all you really did is actually relay the most interesting questions from operators verbatim. So if that's the hot seat, I'll take it.
There we go. We're going to have you back on the hot seat in a couple of weeks. So folks, if you are listening in, go find that newsletter link. We are in week 7 of 2025. There's a button there. You're going to be able to get to a form, submit as many questions as you want, as you need to know, and we'll get them in front of Ben and get you the answers. Ben, you are a co-host this week. We're going to dive in. I almost forgot Mike. Mike, how are you? My longtime co-host. How's everything on your side of the world, Mike?
I'm good. I'm hanging out in what I call Twick Blue, right? Which is just in the process of a move and batten down the hatches for a snowstorm here in DC. One final farewell of a winter kiss before I head to warmer temps. So I'm good and I'm ready to dive in. I'm glad to have Ben here. It's been a while since we've chatted, but I did enjoy that conversation you all had at GWA. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Amazing. So diving into the news this week, we had a really interesting link shared by Christmas over at FlexSpace. They are celebrating pretty much 12 months since rolling out their dynamic pricing engine, sharing some really interesting numbers. Just a rough overview of the numbers that they did share. They saw revenue grow by over 50% by using dynamic pricing. They saw bookings of 4+ hours increase by 16%. They saw meeting room orders grow by 74% year on year. And 36% of their total revenue that they moved through their e-commerce platform was utilizing their AI dynamic pricing engine. This is a huge topic. I know, Mike, you and I have discussed it a bunch of times, but I want to hand this over to our guest co-host, Ben. What are your thoughts on dynamic pricing?
I think what FlexSpace is doing really was that they're taking the demand that an operator already generates itself through its own website and making it much more transactable. And why that's so useful in the meeting room context is meeting rooms you can often generate the most revenue per hour in a meeting room, but the utilization of meeting rooms is typically the lowest in a co-working center. Eyal and Christmas and the team, I think, have created a really smart, simple solution to make that inventory more transactable. And they're also moving it into single desks. So this is a really great use of e-commerce in the office world. And it's taking advantage of where there is a single decision maker and a simple, call it easy to understand product and easy to understand terms and pricing. We're going to see adoption in that. So kudos to them. Not only do I like them, but I think they're smart and they're adding a lot of value to their operator partners, which is good for everybody.
Absolutely. So on the topic of e-commerce is a huge topic, and we are doing an absolute deep dive into the impacts and effects of e-commerce on our industry. So we're definitely going to dig more into that. And I recently just got off a call with EL talking about all of that. But what I wanted to ask you, Ben, is around this idea of there's e-commerce and then there's dynamic pricing, right? Pricing that changes on the day of the week, on capacity, on utilization. I get the idea of increasing prices, but I'm trying to wonder or trying to figure out on the more enterprise side where you play in your main business markets, does dynamic pricing concern you at all? Having different prices from operators where they're expecting a Wednesday should be X amount and a Thursday should be X amount, or is it just a completely different ball game that you're playing?
So here's what I would say. Operators have been doing dynamic pricing since they started, right? The question is, what's the period of dynamism? So before co-working, the period of dynamic pricing was once every 5 years or 10 years when a lease was renegotiated. Then it went to potentially as short as a year or even a month or a quarter, where pricing is dynamic and operators will up their pricing on a quarterly basis, depending on occupancy. So that the concept is not new, but I think what's interesting is how dynamic is the dynamism, meaning we're talking hours within a day, days within a week. That is the innovation here. And I think to me, that's a vision that Instant shares. And we get the benefit of seeing really, I think, smart people figure some things out, but having a lot of scale that we can learn from and in some cases acquire, in other cases, just simply say, wow, what a great idea. We're going to start doing that on our own platforms. So it's in this case, I just think I really respect what the team over there is doing, and they're quite intentional with how they're approaching it.
I love that. Yeah, I'm a big fan of FlexSpace too. And the way that they're approaching this purely from an e-commerce first perspective, as opposed to an operator first perspective. Like what is best for the customer experience, thinking about on that side. But it also there's a thought in my head now. One of the first links I remember sharing when I started doing this newsletter was from a workspace consultant in Italy who started receiving complaints from their customers that they didn't want to be in co-working spaces because the pricing was unreliable. It was short-term leases, and when the space got full, the prices went up, and the companies themselves were unhappy because they didn't know what their rent obligations were going to be 6 months ahead. So that kind of plays into this idea of if everything goes to dynamic pricing for on demand, there's a benefit to signing a bigger contract with someone like an Instant for multiple brands, multiple locations that provides that stability, right? And provides that I know what the rent obligation, I'll still get the benefits of flex, of co-working, but I'm not worried about dynamic pricing anymore. So it's two sides of the same coin, in my opinion. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, what you're talking about is explained in the difference between a low occupancy environment and a high occupancy environment. So many markets around the world are high occupancy environments, which means that there's market leverage that suppliers have to up the pricing. In many markets in the United States, for example, though, it's a low to medium occupancy environment, which means essentially the buyer has the power. So I think there are pros and cons. I don't think we've hit that tipping point yet in the consumer where they're like, wait a minute, I am now not the beneficiary of this. What it makes me think of is what I've heard about the Hong Kong office market, where leases have never been long. And the reason they haven't been long is so that, and by long, 3 years is long in Hong Kong. And the owners drive that because they've been in such a constrained supply environment and a good demand environment for so long, that was beneficial to them. From what I'm hearing from my team in Hong Kong and others, that dynamic is changing a little bit, right? And so there's, I think as with anything, Hector, it's going to go back to what the consumer wants. If the consumer wants certainty and to plan over a long period of time, they can have that. And certainly operators will sign those deals, right? If they may have to deal with kind of unit pricing that is less predictable. And so what's interesting is I studied as an economist. I studied quantitative economics. And the thing that got me into co-working was that this data does not exist for seasonality, for days of the week, for all of this. And I think it's from a nerd perspective, it's a really exciting place to be. From a point of view of, on the supplier side, I've got a fixed asset that I want certainty for, and call it from the corporate side, I've got a fixed budget that I want certainty for. Those two may or may not engage with this world, and it'll be their choice, right?
I'd have to imagine though that creates additional value prop for an organization like Instant though, right? Because if you take a look at the hotelification of office space, right? Even though rooms are in a dynamic market, it's not unusual for companies to have certain contracts with a certain property or a certain brand, right? For example, AWS has one contract rate with Hilton properties. It's already pre-negotiated. So how do you see dynamic pricing not impacting, but changing or adding additional value to what Instant does? Because you do manage these global portfolios. And I know a lot of people listening probably know Instant, but they're maybe not quite sure. You all touch like the entire spectrum of real estate, right? Because you can help put people in their own spaces, but then you can also put them in these short-term or service spaces. But then it sounds to me with this new technology you're rolling out, you're touching more of that on demand.
So I think it puts us in a position where, as an advisor to occupiers, it broadens our ability to make the right recommendation and have the kinds of conversations around variable versus fixed that we're talking about here. Another thing that a lot of people don't know about Instant is a good chunk of our business is what we call the marketplace business or the digital business, where we get demand online and we send that demand through to operators and transact. That's a good chunk of the business. One of the things that many people don't know about Instant is that it has a consulting business called Incendium who primarily consults occupiers of space about how best to evolve their real estate and their thinking for this new world. So we've got some of the smartest people at the company that do that for some of the biggest companies in the world. And even more so, we have another real estate solution called our managed or our Work-A-Made offering that takes, really for large corporates who want private office space but want flexibility, we'll take and manage and build out space for single tenants all over the world. And to this point, one of the most surprising things that I've learned about that business is that we'll come in with, hey, we can help you open up in a new market and sign a much shorter lease than average, call it 3 years. And would you like that? And the surprise to me is sometimes the occupiers, and this goes to your point, Hector, sometimes the occupiers are saying, we like this. Could we have it for 7? And so the purists in the flexible workspace world look at that and would say, is that even flex anymore? And the truth is, we don't know that's flex necessarily, but we know it meets the occupier's need for that particular time. So we've opened offices recently in this way in Mexico City and Kuala Lumpur and all over the world. And sometimes in those markets, when a corporate is new to that market, they'll choose the certainty. So we're learning across the spectrum of our business what flex means and what it means to occupiers, what it means to operators, but also what it means to landlords, right? And how each is reacting to it.
Absolutely. Mike, did you want to add anything else there?
Nope, that was great.
Hear your question though, Mike. There was something in there.
Oh, no, the question was, though, is just trying to better understand what opportunity there is for Instant to better negotiate or support the adoption of dynamic pricing, right? Because there are a lot of corporate real estate leaders that will go back and take a look at what their most recent spend was in the quarter, and then they're immediately just carrying that over. But they don't do that necessarily for all of their airfare costs, or they don't use that, maybe some of their hotels. So it was just very interesting. Like there's actually additional value here because without creating too much exposure for you all, you could even for a large enough client provide that stability and then just take the risk on what the dynamic price is for the provider that you're brokering, right?
So like many of the players in the flexible workspace market, as this starts to evolve, and by this, the evolution from fixed long-term leases to various new models, Instant's got both, I think, the opportunity to add value to occupiers by doing things like removing risk, increasing certainty. We talk a lot about balancing CapEx with OpEx. We've done a lot of really interesting things around lowering occupiers' CapEx to get into spaces, which is really interesting. But I want to double click on in my answer about it. It makes Instant a better advisor to occupiers to have this kind of, call it, rainbow of choices, from let's use our team product to help you manage to a budget, but also manage individual spends for individual people in individual cities to that budget. And so that's exciting for us that makes us more than an advisor. That makes us truly a platform. And I think in Instant's history, we've been really known as one of the best corporate advisors for Flex. And we built an amazing business that way. This allows us to bake that knowledge into our product set to where our clients can self-manage. And that, to me, that's a really exciting opportunity for us and for our clients.
Absolutely. And by rising that tide, all the boats get lifted. But I do want to quickly change the topic, given that that's a recap episode. We did also see a link about a story where Shopify and Simon, the mall owner, doing a partnership to create either new brick and mortar businesses or expand existing Shopify customers' brick and mortar offerings. This doesn't sound like a co-working story, but if you've ever been to the Etsy offices or the eBay offices and you look around in their lobby, you're like, this looks and feels a lot like a co-working space. There are makers, there are creators, there are all these people collaborating. I'm like, how long do you think it will take before there are partnerships between the eBays, the Etsys, the Shopifys of the world, the ones that are creating the online commerce, and the folks who are using those platforms congregating in a physical space? It's obvious to me that it's going to happen. My question is, what do you guys think? Is it going to happen fast? Is it going to be something we see down the line? And why hasn't it happened yet?
It has happened. Not to steal your thunder. I don't know if you were going to say that, Ben.
No, go ahead. You go
Well,
first.
no. It's not a necessarily new concept. I think of Bespoke in San Francisco in the Westfield flagship mall. It was designed for events. It grew into events, but originally it was an incubator for retail tech or direct to consumer retail. We even had like conference rooms that had doors that would open up into the mall on the weekends for storefronts and then would open up into the co-working space on the back end for during the weekdays. So not Hector's what the smartest guy in co-working, but how did you not know about that? I had to give you a hard time for that. But Ben, take it away.
So
What were you next?
I have a meta reaction to this story, and I'll set it up this way by saying, because I'm old enough to remember when e-commerce was just starting out, and brick and mortar retailers at first said, this is not going to be anything really big and we're not worried about it, to then the dot-com boom and then the bust and all this stuff. So I was around for that and working in the internet in those days. What ended up happening is that obviously e-commerce has taken a huge chunk out of retail. And there's been these digitally native retail brands that have started. And the way I interpreted that story is this is about what's the value of a digitally native brand finding a brick and mortar location. That's how I took it. And what's the corollary here in work and an office? So here's where I went with it. And you can say this is fantastical or whatever, but there is a corollary in creating remote only workplaces. When one of my good friends, Dave DuPont, ran a company over the last, sold it a couple of years ago for $2 billion. It was a remote only company for the first 8 years of its existence before any of us were talking about it. And he talked about his story was, hey, we got the best talent this way. We saved a lot of money this way. But when they got to, I don't know, $100 million in valuation, they were like, hey, we need a brick and mortar office for really specific reasons. And back then and so this is what I mean by a digitally native company going back to the office.
Yeah.
When they needed to bring in a lot of young employees who needed to be trained and onboarded, who didn't quite maybe have the house or the infrastructure or the interest to work as the three of us work remotely, they needed the right solution for that. And so they did that. I think if you asked Dave today, he would say we really didn't need to do that, but it felt like we did. What that feels like to me is a future trend, which is we're going to see a bunch of remote first and remote only companies coming out of this, and we have already, who are really doing a great job and growing and doing great that way. But they will find a use case like a digitally native brand for a retail location for a physical location. And so my customers, the suppliers of space, I think would be really smart to think about that, because it may look like co-working today, or it may look like what some others in the market are doing, which is, hey, let's take a 5,000 square foot office and make it available 2 days a week, right? Or make it available for full days, almost going back to the breather model. If anybody remembers Breather, right? Breather, this is something that I think Breather was preparing for outside of maybe some other issues in the business. But to me, that's how I interpreted this story, Hector. And if I could be just completely off base, but that's how I saw it, was the digitally native companies or remote first companies that at some point come back and say, we've got a use for this. And it's really specific. And it's this.
Yeah. That's why I love bringing in more co-hosts. I know Mike and I, we have fairly similar views, and we do argue sometimes here and disagree, not argue. But it's always good to bring in some different eyes and look at things from a different way. I can completely see the trend lines between some of the other conversations we've had, some of the other newsletters we've sent out of this kind of on-site, remote off-sites. What was Phil Kirshner's one? Hyperlocal travel, bringing teams together for specific days, fractional offices and the 30% margins that they're creating, only renting 2 days a week or 3 days a week. So it's really, I can totally see the through lines that you're following. And I'm a huge fan of that. I'm a little bit surprised I didn't see it, but that's why we always like to bring on fantastic people to co-host. And I agree with you that we are going to see this shift from online only to now also having an office, also having, whether it is 1 day a week or 1 month a year or 1 week a month or whatever it is, people, as you said, they're going to find a new creative way to use office space. And as folks like us in the industry, we have to make sure that we're ready to welcome those guests and build a business model around it that is sustainable. Because right now we were thinking 2020, 2021, meeting rooms. We're just going to sell meeting rooms. People come in for an hour, they leave. That is a meeting room sale. But that's not what meeting rooms are being used for today, right? People are booking for 4+ hours, as we saw from FlexSpace. People are booking for whole days, half days. They're booking it for an entire week. They want to use the meeting room for a week for their whole team to come together. They then want additional services, catering, entertainment services, Broadway tickets, like all these different things are now coming into the model, which the concierge level was never part of our business model for many. And now it's becoming part of it because these companies aren't thinking of office the way we thought of office. So that's really interesting. I love that perspective. Thank you for sharing it.
So again,
Go ahead.
totally random thing here, but I'm going back to the days of like 80s movies, right? Where everybody went to the mall and that was a repeat experience, right?
Mhm.
Do that every weekend or whatever. That's similar to how we expect people to use the office.
Mhm.
Now we've transitioned through e-commerce and remote work and whatever into this concept of pop-up retail. So what we're talking about is the pop-up office. And there are lots of through lines here that I think it's probably more fun to prognosticate than it is to actually build out these spaces. Cause as we all know, things like meeting rooms, you know, we love the hourly rate we can get for them. But we hate the occupancy and the utilization that they have. So same kind of challenges. And again, this is where the data and knowledge and all this kind of come into, and the dynamic pricing kind of fit to enable this type of consumption.
And just on that note, I wanted to add one more thought that I had. And that was, we're seeing so many malls open up co-working spaces to increase the footfall into the malls. Isn't it logical then that the co-working spaces with great ground floor space will then add pop-up malls or pop-up retail experiences because they have the footfall that the mall doesn't? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, my first reaction is the continued blending of the kind of the look and feel of certain things. Mike, I don't know if you'd agree, but a lot of co-working spaces look and feel like really nice hotels, at least in their common areas. And that's
Yeah.
a generally pleasing experience. You have to make it look a certain way to get people to be attracted to it. And it's got some F&B, which you're seeing a lot more of now, to fill that
Yep.
out. So that blending of physical space and multi-use space, I think, is a core of what we're talking about. I
Yeah.
remember the first time I saw a dentist in a WeWork.
Yeah.
Where
Hey, I
where
didn't, I, that's a new one. I haven't heard of that one before. I knew
oh, yeah.
therapists, I knew stylists, and yeah, I never heard of a dentist. That's a
So
new one. And they were in there. They made it work.
they did.
Wow.
To call it a dentist, I think, was an Invisalign, to be honest, but
Okay.
it
Okay.
didn't have
That's,
big overhead lighting and all the
I
stuff you
was like,
get.
yeah, did they have the big with the chair and everything? No, I'm so glad you brought that up because to your point, minus the F&B, I've been to a brand new Apple store and boy, did it feel like a co-working space or a
Okay.
lobby, which is no different than some of these more, you go to any new academic buildings on college campuses, it's like this evolved lobby. It's almost like my favorite co-working space is an airport lounge, right? Where it's got that full spectrum. My 2 cents is just, it's been fascinating not only to get your initial take on this story, Ben, because my marketing mind went directly to, I think of back in the days where co-working spaces were monetizing the community through like activations, which are totally cool, like that type of retail marketing angle. I think that retail and co-working in particular, or office space, they've been doing this dance lately, or not lately, but over the last 5 years, right? You had WeWork buying the Hudson Bay Company building, and then the Saks doing the Saks work. It's just, I feel like it's just this general collision just to activated space. And so it makes total sense to have some large communal tables where people can hot desk and then maybe have like, whether it be automated retail or little bodegas, or you can rotate in different themes for the month, no different than like the holiday markets
Yep.
in like Bryant Park. So it's just really cool to see how it's finally coming together. We've all of us on this screen probably we got 30 years combined. It's finally happening, right?
Well, just wait. So one of my favorite kind of owners and operators of real estate is Jamestown. For anybody that's in New York, Chelsea Mark is
Yeah.
one example, but they've done that 20 or 30 times around the
Mm-hmm.
world. Adaptive reuse and
Mhm.
making something into something else. That trend is really about to explode as the kind of excess office market inventory starts to clear. So I've been trying to think through because I wasn't alive when the industrial spaces all went bust 100 years ago, roughly, and then got replaced by lofts. That transition is not something that I personally experienced, but we're going to see a version of that with office becoming something else. And pure residential is maybe 25% of that.
Mhm.
So what's the other 75? You're going to bring these big buildings down? Are we going to do adaptive reuse on something that isn't maybe as nostalgic as a biscuit factory? What are we going to do? And so this type of thinking, I think, is going to explode probably as the capital markets hopefully get to a place where it can support it, as the world gets comfortable with the role of the office again after the
Mhm.
disruption that was COVID. So these are really exciting times to be talking about this type of product thinking.
Absolutely. And on that note, on that level of excitement, I'm going to say thank you, Mike, for co-hosting. Thank you, Ben, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any thoughts or comments, drop them below wherever you're listening to this, or reach out at podcast@thisweekincoworking.com. And don't forget, if you have questions for Ben that you want answered about what's happening at the Instant Group, hit that link and submit your questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic week.